We are so happy you joined us. Welcome, everyone. We are so happy you joined us today. We have an amazing session lined up, so I am going to keep the intro and the housekeeping short. First thing you just noticed is that we are recording today's session, but we totally respect if you do not wish to be a part of the recording. If so, just feel free to leave your camera off and leave your questions and comments in the chat, and we'll see them as well and can include them in the discussion, even without including footage of you. Today is all about what we can learn from the new book by Wendy and Marianne. And when I first heard that they were working on this book, I was so happy because from my interactions with practitioners, families, and friends as well, I felt that we really needed something more accessible to non-academics because Paradox is just so powerful in making sense and reacting to the world around us. So I'm really happy we're getting together for this book launch today. So in the book, Wendy and Marianne help readers cope and thrive with multiple tensions at the same time. They have over 20 years of experience of pioneering research and have recently received the Academy of Management Review Decade Award. In the book, they provide an actionable framework for transforming the tensions that we're confronted with into opportunities for innovation and personal growth. The session today has 3 parts. And first, Wendy and Marianne will be joined by Jean Bartunek for a discussion of the book and its relevance to the Paradox community. So I Googled Jean because I wanted to look for something super crisp to say. And I noticed you have 45 pages of CVs, all full with achievements and different honors. So let me point out 2 reasons why Jean is the perfect conversation partner today.
Well, everybody, by the time you all are my age, you'll all have that.
Well, you persevered through everything as well, so very, very impressive. But there are 2 reasons I want to point out why it's so great to have you here today. One is that you're so interested in the links between theory, research, and practice, which I think is perfect for this specific book launch. And you're focused on collaborative research and how knowledge is shared across boundaries. And as Wendy and Marianne say in their book, as they developed their own ideas about Paradox, they stood on the shoulders of giants who expanded insights about Paradox long before us. And they have lots of vivid memories of cherished and energizing discussions with so many great scholars, including Jean Bartunek. So we're really happy to have the 3 of you here today for another energizing discussion. In the second part of the session today, we're going to loop in Iris and Margaret from the amazing PhD reading group. They're representing the PhD community today, which is the future of Paradox research, and they will prompt Wendy and Marianne with the questions that are on their minds, reading this book and looking at the world outside today. And then finally, in Paradox community fashion, we're going to open it up and have time for everyone to join in for an interactive Q&A part. So really just let us know what your questions are, and we'll try to address as many as possible. And then you'll probably have to return to the book for some of the others. And now, without further ado, I'm happy to hand over to Jean for an exciting part 1.
Thank you very much, Katrina, and all who are been involved in organizing this. This is what the book looks like for those of you who haven't actually seen it. It's a fabulous book. I believe that when you all got the original invitation, you also got copies of the introduction in chapter 1. And so that's really useful to have. If you didn't get that, which you may not have near the end, it's worth it to have somebody send it to you. But it's also then worth it to, I'll let Mayor and Wendy talk about how you can get your own copy. So my role here is just to engage in a conversation with Mayor and Wendy for about a half hour or so to ask them some questions, to make a couple comments of things that struck me myself. And what I'd like to start out by doing, because I think if I recall correctly, I know the answer to this question, but I may not recall it. But I think it would be helpful if they talked about a little how they happen to come to be working together, because there's no necessary reason that this occurred.
Wendy, you started this.
Well,
Jean, first of all, Jean, thank you. Katrine and Angela, thank you. It is such, I was going to say a pleasure. It feels actually emotionally a little overwhelming to be at this moment today. We were talking with Lotta as people got on about how long it's taken this book and to get here and how many people have been involved. And really, as I look out at this group, we have, as Katrine said, and we can tell this story too, started out by building on work, Jean, that you and a whole community of people did, and a whole community of people that we see here. So, and it is great to have people who are new here to join us that we have not yet met. So thank you. Thank you all for, we see this book as a product of so many people's work and as an offering back to that community of people. So thank you for that. I'll just briefly say that I like to tell the story, and I like to say it in the language that I stalked Marianne. She doesn't always love that, but it comes out of a piece that Warren Bennis wrote about stalking your mentors. And that's how I talk about how we met. I was in grad school. I was studying top management teams at IBM and how they innovated. I thought there was something interesting about Paradox, and Mare had written that brilliant and beautiful paper that won the AMR's Best Paper Award of the Year. It was one of the few that had been published, within the last several years around Paradox. Most people were telling me not to study Paradox. And that you could not really publish around Paradox. And yet Mare had written this beautiful, brilliant paper. And so I emailed her and said, please, 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 can we meet at Academy? And as they say, the rest is history, I guess. So Marianne, I'll turn it over to you.
No, I think it's a pretty fair assessment, and she always makes me laugh when she says stalker, but there are a few other stalkers on this call, including Lotta, and I am just dearly grateful for people who found me and said I've seen them. I mean, that's how so many of my collaborations started, and maybe that's exactly how they should start, right? That you're starting connected around a common phenomena, interest, curiosity, and it's really pushed. And I think, Jean, that's how we met you. In the exact same way.
Yeah, I think it was something like that. And I think I recall Wendy telling a little of that story at the time the three of us all talked together.
Well, and let me clarify. When I say it's similar with Jean, so everybody understands us on this call, we stalked Jean.
Oh.
The stalker and the stalkie switched, but and I remember when we met Jean, we were like, Jean Bartunek. And so I thank you for taking the time to talk to some real newbies and help us think through what we were trying to get our head around.
Well, it's I'm the one who's lucked out in this.
Jean, so, I'll just say it's worth it to sort of expand on that for a minute, because I think this is what got us launched. In part, when Marianne said we stalked Jean, what we did was we were starting to write the paper that eventually became the 2011 paper. And we, as Katrine said there were giants in the field that had been writing about Paradox, but that work hadn't been expanded upon significantly. So Marianne and I, at a different academy together, emailed a small handful of the people that were in a compendium written by Bob Quinn, or edited by Bob Quinn and Kim Cameron, Jean, you being one of them. And there was about 5 or 6 people. And we said, we want to write about Paradox. You all have been in this handbook compendium. Can we talk to you? And that is in part what fueled so many of our ideas that became the 2011 paper. And it was, Jean, it was you, and it was Andy Van de Ven, who was a brilliant supporter of this work, as you know, and it was Bob and Kim, Bob Quinn and Kim Cameron, and several others, Kathy Eisenhart, several others. So we are grateful to that.
And I just can, to everybody on this call, I hope one of the takeaways to that it is when you ask people, they will say yes. We were amazed that every single person we reached out to said yes, that they'd love to talk. And I think we were really nervous when we did it. And I'm just so grateful that we did.
Before asking you more, one of the things that struck me in many ways throughout the book, but they mentioned it in chapter 1 and in her foreword to the book, Amy Edmondson quoted for those of you not in the US, Amy Edmondson quoted the immortal words of a senator from Kentucky when he was mad at Elizabeth Warren. He used the words, "Yet she persevered." And Amy said of Mare and Wendy, yet they persevered despite all the challenges they ran into. And I would just like to comment, my sense is that Paradox isn't possible without perseverance. I may be wrong. It's not a fancy theory, but I think many of the instances the two of you described in your life don't just happen instinctively. So why'd you write the book? I mean, so let me build on that a little bit for those of you who can't see it right now. One of the things they do that for me is awesome is go beyond basically the theory that they had laid out before. And they talk a lot about what in the world is somebody going to do with this stuff? And what are ways that people can develop, can learn, can develop their skills in different areas. And I think for me, it's really exciting. And it's a step beyond that you can do it, that they can do in a book that you can't often do in a journal article. So could you talk a little about how you came to write the book? This, not just any book, but this book.
All right, I'll start that. To Wendy's point of, we've actually started writing this book before. So like in 2014, I wrote a bunch of it with Wendy's kind of lead while I was on a sabbatical, but it was a real research book. It was much more, and I'm not saying it wasn't a good idea, but as Jean just said, you have a different kind of freedom in a book. And you know, I got a little sidetracked in that London sabbatical and then ended up as a dean over there. So we kind of put it aside, and I'm so grateful we did, because I do think that's part of serendipity, some good planned luck. You know, as you said, Jean, when we were starting out, and I know maybe some of you still get this now. I mean, I cannot tell you how many people told each of us separately, this is a bad idea. You shouldn't be writing on Paradox. It's too abstract. It's too philosophical. It's too complicated. Stop it. And now we look around and we hear the language all over. We hear it in strategies, we hear it in advertisements, we hear it. And, you know, I mean, one of my lines in that 2000 piece was shifting it from a label to a lens. And now it feels like, given that the label is out there all over, how do we help people move from a label to a lens beyond the academic community? So I think that was a real part of it.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'll just highlight part of what Mare said, because I think that's one of the ideas that we think about Paradox, which is living in the experimentation, dynamism, change on an ongoing basis. And in some ways, we were living in this paradox, this tension of abstract ideas and concrete application, of rigor and relevance, academic and practitioner, and trying to figure out how to capture that in something we were going to offer out to the world in this book. And we shifted in our in how we emphasize that, because the first book was going to be a very academic and somewhat abstract book along the way. And I think part of the process of this book reflects what we think is important for Paradox, which is living in the dynamism, experimentation, serendipity, sort of evolution along the way. And that is what this book was. It really evolved from an academic book into what it is. And I, to Marianne's point, don't think that we could have written this book if it wasn't for the work that she did on sabbatical, pulling together so much of the research that then became the foundation, but then allowed us to speak about it in a very different voice to a very different audience.
Let me just build on that a little bit in a question. Wendy, you just used the term living in the dynamism. Both of you describe experiences that you later came to realize were paradoxical. Mayor, one of the ones for you was giving this awful talk where I think it was LBS, am I remembering that right?
Yeah.
At London Business School,
Oh,
where
you're right.
she gave this wonderful scholarly talk, and everybody there gave her just gigantic quantities of grief. And so she, even rather than taking the tube back to where she was living, she walked. And oh God, this sucks. And well, maybe you did, that's what I would think, but
No, that's what I was thinking.
and somehow out of that, she ended up being a dean because of the way she handled the awful people. And Wendy, you described this angst about your children watching video games or missing a Zoom class, but the video games leads to this, disagreement with your husband. And are you a bad mom? Is he a bad dad? One or the other. It had to be for a while. And I was thinking, and there are lots more examples like this throughout the book. And I was thinking, well, paradox may feel awful when it's in process. And maybe it's when we later say, well, look at this. I was living through paradox. Hey, isn't this swell? That enables you to later reconcile what the awful experience was with your later thinking. But I was also struck by the fact that you gave a couple examples early on, one of Barack Obama saying, well, I've got to balance this country's need with this other country's need, and John McCain saying something similar. And I don't see in what you wrote either of them saying, oh my God, I feel like such a horrible president or horrible candidate for president. So there are a couple of questions that this evokes for me. One is, are women more likely to experience the dynamism of paradox as this is really screwed up than men are? Are there some kinds of problems that are more likely to be, that don't feel paradoxical, they just feel awful when you're going through them? And others that seem like, like logical paradoxes that just feel like, oh, isn't this kind of fun? So for me, at least, that's a useful question that comes from your book. And I could imagine for other people, if we're going to try to operate paradoxically, that's also an important question. And it's also, for me, one of the places where I saw perseverance as absolutely crucial.
Well, maybe I'll start here. Jean, here's what I love. I mean, I always love being in conversation with you. And here's what I love about the question. So one of the things that we think is a contribution of this book, and then as Katrine said, we had the privilege, the honor of writing an updated AMR as a result of the AMR Decade Award. And so what we see as sort of the heart of this book, and what we can say to our academic friends here is a model in which what we've done is pulled together the research from this community into 4 different buckets. And so again, it's in the heart of this book, and it's in the AMR article. And partially, and we talk about them as A, B, C, D to make them easy to remember, where A is assumptions, it's all about our mindsets. B is the boundaries, the structures that help support how we engage paradox. At C and D, C is comfort or our emotions, and D is dynamism. And the reason that I say this is because so there's often a criticism or challenge or question of paradox scholars of whether we overemphasize cognition mindsets, what we call the assumptions. Jean, what I love about your questions is that you've just drilled, and then we go to structures. We sort of, so the A and B get more play than the C and D, the emotions and the change. And what I love about your—
But they're all in there, all in there.
Right. What I love about your questions is you pull this away from, you've emphasized what we think are really important, but don't get as much attention, which is dynamism, change, experimentation, and that piece, the D, and the emotions, the C, which we think are so critical and don't get as much play. So what you've done is you've shifted us over to this question about emotions and just how deeply emotional it is to navigate paradox. And when it comes to emotions, you know, the C, the label we put on that is finding comfort in the discomfort, because what we hope to do and what we've
Which
seen—
is a great phrase, which is a fabulous phrase. I'll just stick that in. If you feel, everybody who's here, if you feel awful, this was really terrible, just have a little side of you say, actually, this is kind of swell that everything feels terrible. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, right. Yes, you normalize the discomfort, right? Normal, because that is where the generativity and creativity, that's where we push ourselves to the edge. I want to just, I don't know if Camille is on here. I want to just sort of give a shout out to Camille and her recent paper on vets, because it's all about the emotionality of engaging with competing demands. And so indeed, you know, what I love is exactly your point, Jean, and I hope that we can share this more broadly, is if you're feeling the struggle and the pain, something good is going on. And we hope that, you know, hope that instead of feeling lonely in it or frustrated in it, that is where the creativity emerges. So,
you hope.
You hope, right? Well, but I think I'm going to go to a different part of your question. I mean, two parts. One is, you know, we've said before, and others on this call have said before, that paradox is a double-edged sword, right? That creative friction can be absolutely paralyzing, anxiety provoking, you know, defense provoking, etc. And it can be like, oh, there's something here, right? There's something here. I got to dive deeper. I got to understand it. I got to work through it. And you asked, Jean, about the women's issue. And I think it's a really interesting one. And I think Wendy and I often joke, not so jokingly, that our next book is going to be on paradoxes of women's leadership or women's paradoxes. But, you know, sometimes I wonder if it wasn't a coincidence that it's not just Wendy and me, but like I remember the Wendy, Paula, and my conversation at EGOS, and you know, we had Amy right the front. When we studied a paradox mindset, you know, we said there were two elements to it. Yes, there's the I think paradoxically, I like to embrace tensions and I work through them. But the other piece of it is I'm aware of tensions, right? That I see them, I experience them, which to me gets a real emotional piece to your point, Jean. And I mean, the one I was thinking about this morning, I don't even know why I was thinking about it, is I remember in my first dean's job, I had this burning question in my head, are all great deans assholes? Excuse my language. And I really—
and the answer
I was
is
like,
yes, right?
Dean, you know, I started studying it, I started interviewing, but one of the things that was my aha there is that underlying that challenging question in my head was actually a deeper paradox that you see quite a bit in studies of women's leadership, which is this paradox between competency and compassion. And they are not opposites. Now, sometimes they feel opposites and they feel like they pull us in opposing directions, but they can also work really beautifully together. And I think that's true in a lot of places, but that question took me down a really interesting path to understand what a particular tension about leadership, but I had to feel it first. There was something about saying, oh, wow, I just felt so uncomfortable in that moment. And working through it was freeing in some ways.
So this strikes me as really important. I believe that what you're both saying in some way is there has to be a level of self-reflection, of awareness that isn't totally blocked for you to let in the tension. For you to say, gee, this could be one outcome and this could be the other outcome, or this could be one way of acting, or this could be the other. And how do I at least recognize there's a tension there? And then after I recognize the tension, then what do I do? I believe that's one of you're not necessarily saying that, but I think you actually are. So let me just point out to everybody that they have in the book, they mentioned it in chapter 4, and then they have in the appendix, Paradox Mindset Inventory. So it's this is one example of something that I found was just really helpful to enable me to reflect on what's going on paradoxically. And I will say that when I took the measure, I scored really high on both the amount of tension I experienced and my paradox mindset. So I personally think, and I'd like to see how the two of you respond to this. This is due to one of two reasons. One is I cheated, or the other is that, man, I have a lot more tension in my life than I realized. So how would you respond when I say this is due to one of those two reasons and nothing else? Am I reflecting a paradox mindset?
Yes.
No.
Absolutely. Well, Jean, I want to say two things. First, I want to just go back for 1 minute before we leave behind the emotionality, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Because one thing that I've been thinking a lot about is the value of other people in our lives helping us and supporting us to engage with paradox. And I think that's really important. And you know, I have always been a big proponent of community and mentors and support. And it is clear to me that my own work, my own thinking, you know, has been pushed ahead significantly by community and people, and partially because when it gets so emotional and difficult, that's when we turn to other people. And here I want to just give a quick shout out to, I think I saw Vani joining us as well, but to Vani's work on Paradox Peers, or the idea of having people who also navigate similar paradoxes to us that help us both cognitively and emotionally engage with them. And I think that's been true all around. So I want to just say that to the point about emotions and how we think about how we think. And so Vani, I just saw your text. Someone can put her, you know, Katrina, I saw you put Camille's paper up. So maybe we can put up Vani's paper too. And yeah, so I'll just say that. And then Jean, I'll say that people can go, the Paradox Inventory is online. You can go online, you can take it, you can have teams take it. We've just set it up. So if people want to give people a code and you want to use it for research, you can do that and download. You can let us know and we can download your group of people. So there, it's available free, and we've made it available to make it easy for people to use for research and for, you know, if you're consulting or if you're working with teams. We've used it with senior teams. And then finally, Jean, I think our team, and this is Ella, I think Josh is online, and Amy Ingram, we've had long conversations about this idea of experiencing tensions and whether that experience comes from the context, there are more tensions in the context, or whether that experience comes from being someone who knows that the tensions just exist all around and we surface them and see them more. And yes, I think it's both of those. We see them more when it's so much, when the context makes them more real to us, and we see them more when we are looking for them. And our team, you know, this is a piece of research out there to be done, I think, of pulling those two pieces apart. And our team that developed the Paradox Mindset Inventory really speaks about both of these as triggers for why people experience more tensions.
Okay, great. The reason I purposely before it said either or, which is I had framed that as non-paradoxical, but then look at this, you end up finding paradox even when I'm clueless. Okay, now I'm going to ask one more question if this is okay, and then I'm happy to turn it over to the doctoral students. But I think this is an important question. I think it's certainly variations of this are coming up in the US a lot. I think they're coming up in many European countries a lot. I'm going to take an example just for the book, where you talk about Dr. Seuss writing a book where he only includes 50 different words. And was that the Green Eggs, a book called Green Eggs and Ham, which I assume has been published in other countries too. But one of the things that has recently happened with Dr. Seuss is that his family has taken several of his books out of circulation because of racist and insensitive imagery in the books. And I got this online, and the offensive images in the canceled books include disturbing racist stereotypes of Black people, Asians, and Arabs. Detractors have accused liberals of canceling the beloved children's author. And this is an issue, I think, that is very salient, is not expressed in paradoxical terms. He might have done all this clever stuff, but he's a racist. So he doesn't belong in conversation. Right now in the US, to my mind, there are several, I wouldn't call them conversations, several disagreements about abortion rights, about gun control, and several other issues. And I think that in Europe, there are probably some equivalent things. And for me, this is an absolutely crucial issue of how do you take something like this about which people have very strong opinions and they hate people on the other side and think paradoxically about it. I think it's worth it for you to respond to this however you want, and then I'd be happy to leave off. But I really enjoy talking with you too. So I'm glad to have this excuse, even at 7 o'clock in the morning.
Go ahead, Wen. Want to start?
I feel like this is yours, Mayor.
Well, I mean, it's a big one, Jean, and it makes me very sad. I didn't know about the Dr. Seuss example that you just shared. I don't think we're going to learn if we don't have these conversations, and if we don't recognize, the power of space and time, and that I'm so grateful that we continue to change and learn and progress. And I think we can think about some, the work in the past and say, well, what was mistaken about that work, and how do we value the good parts? I think if we keep throwing the baby out with the bathwater, we limit ourselves. And that to me is part of the challenge of either or thinking. It is limiting. And I think you used a word that just gets me. We're back to the emotion piece. It's hate is a stopper of conversations, of learning, of compassion, of progress. And it means that we do need to put ourselves in more difficult conversations. And it's not shouting people down. It's about curiosity and compassion and understanding what are the experiences and understandings that brought you here. Because I do think it's back to the blind man and the elephant. These are incredibly complicated, moving targets. And we learn so much by understanding not just what you think, much more importantly to me, why are you there? Because I think it shines whole light some places. I mean, Wendy and I have spent so many late nights, we write about it a bit in the book, discussing things. And I always leave my discussions with Wendy, and she's helped me do it with others, saying, I didn't know. I wouldn't have thought. I didn't. And that just changes my view whenever I hear debates now, because I've had the pleasure of having those challenging often discussions.
Yeah, Jean, I would just add, I am so glad you asked that question, because as Marianne said, we have been thinking a lot about political polarization around the world and just how destructive it is for us collectively to move forward as a society, and how either or it is. And that, you know, one of the things that we've been talking a lot about is how the both and starts in one-on-one conversation at the kitchen table, where people can boldly and courageously have conversations with one another that have different opinions than themselves. And we go back to, you know, one of my favorite books is Parker Palmer's Healing the Heart of Democracy, or we go back to Mary Parker Follett and her ideas of democracy happening in the town halls with the people that we know best, that we can build trust with, and be able to share differences, very vehement differences of political opinions and values, and yet really respect and trust them. And, you know, we just wrote a piece that we published, we can share it in Market Watch, about the Dobbs decision. And we have a piece that's going to come out in Newsweek as well about how we can push toward more both anding that starts at the kitchen table, where people could have conversations with people that have different political opinions than themselves, and they don't have to agree, but start to learn from one another. And maybe that's our next project, because we both feel really passionate about this.
We do.
Well, yeah, thank you. And I'm sorry to have taken extra time, but
Oh, thank you.
as you can see, I mean, I could have been talking with them forever. And I hope we can continue the conversation, but this last question to me was just really important to get out there. And the Dobbs decision, incidentally, is the one about abortion rights in the US, for those of you who aren't here. But thank you both very much. I'm really glad to have had this opportunity to be with you. I really encourage everybody to read the book, and not just read it, but to try out some of its ideas. And so thank you. And I'm happy to turn this over to Iris and Margaret, I think, right?
Thank you so much, Jean. I'm going to share my screen and hand over to Margaret, because she's the one starting shooting questions. And I think we start with a simple question concerning the cover of the book.
Yeah, I would like to say thank you very much for inviting us and inviting the PhD reading group to this session. And one of the things we did, of course, we started from the cover and we discussed the logo a little bit. And we see the contrast, the interweaving and interconnectedness. And in reflecting on the cover, it also ties in with some of the discussions we've been having in the PhD reading group, which has been running for over 2 years now. And therein we, of course, employ the shared characteristics of paradox. And while it seems sort of low-lying to tease out contradiction, guided by your book, and your experience as experts, how can scholars tease out and generate further understanding of persistence and interrelatedness in the tension elements that we observe in our research and in general in daily life?
Well, I'll start here. First of all, I want to just honor the PhD reading group. I love that you guys have built this kind of community connection with one another. So congratulations to all of you, to all of those that have been organizing this group and participating in it. And I don't know if you're open to new people that are on this call that want to join the conversations, but I hope that you are pushing one another to think deeply with each other. I am sure you are. And so thank you to all of you, and congrats on that group. I'll just say that we had zero influence on this cover. They asked us exactly what we wanted. We told them something completely contrary to this, and here it is. And that's the way it goes with book writing. And we both have decided that we love it at this point. And part of it is that every time we show it to different people, they have different reactions to what it's about. My 10-year-old son pointed out that the little squiggly black lines look like M's and W's. So we kind of like that part as well. Different people have said very different things. And I think that your question, and maybe Mary, I'll turn this over to you, it is really about persistence and interwovenness of paradox, which invites us to go beyond the sort of contradictory, interdependent, but really sort of look deeper into the nature of paradox, which is, I think, the brilliance of that question and the importance of understanding paradox. So, Mara, I'll turn that over to you.
No, I think the only other thing I'd add is just, it's amazing to me that they brought something that we really were like, what? And then now have come to love. But I think it also shows there's just such beautiful power in imagery. And I've appreciated working with people like Ella, Myron Spector, and others who have brought more imagery into, like a recent article that we've written for the collections, the Academy of Management collections, because pictures just tell 1,000 words. I mean, I'm looking around my office. I don't think you can see it, but like I have Eschers around my office, and there's something Escher-like in even this. It's about flow and following, and it becomes almost a Rorschach test. You see the tensions in this, right? But so thank you for that.
And Margaret, I'll just say, and you know, I love the work that you've been doing on imagery and imagery from Africa and Ubuntu. And I don't know if I'm saying this right, but I do think that the symbolism that we use, one of the things we find when we talk to practitioners, and for those of you, I know Lotta's here, I know Cliff is here. Cliff, it's nice to see you, but people who really, there's a group of you that really work with, you know, real people outside of the ivory tower. And one of the things that we find in trying to translate these ideas from academia into the real world is making these ideas as real as possible to people. And one way to do that is through imagery, where people can understand these abstract ideas and figure out how they apply to their own world. And part of that is with stories, and part of that we hear from leaders is with metaphors. So, you know, I often talk about Terry Kelly from Gore, who talks about breathing in, breathing out as a metaphor for paradox, or Zita Cobb in Newfoundland, and some work I've done with Natalie Slawinski about a cauliflower that is the paradox of local global, because you've got the strong global core supporting all these local little florets. Whatever it is, I think that when we are working with and talking to leaders and managers, I think we do need to figure out how to translate these very abstract ideas into something that they understand, and imagery is one good way to do it.
Great, and over to Iris.
More images to come when we've been talking about images. And the next question, and I'm starting asking Marianne, and if Wendy needs to intervene, of course you're allowed to, because we want to ask about your cooperation process during writing this book. So we are really curious about how was the process of doing this together? Were there tensions? We are very curious, and also maybe what can we learn also from you cooperating, and the sense of where does both end thinking and mindset help us when working with people? Because I think many of us in the community of young scholars, we have these experiences writing with our supervisors, which is a specific right. Agreement and cooperation, a lot of power imbalances, so a lot of tensions to cope with. I mean, I think it's amazing to learn from you both on this process of cooperation.
No, I love that question, and I just feel deeply grateful to Wendy, but also, you know, all of other co-authors I've had the pleasure of working with, and sometimes they don't always work out well. I mean, I think one of the things that Wendy and I, at least for me, have modeled is this yin yang, that on the one hand, we share so much of the same approach to our thinking and our desires for a better world through problem solving, and at the same time we are really different. I mean, we are very distinct in some of our capabilities and our skills, and one of them that I would stress in this book was we are really different writers. And I'm not saying we don't have the same ideas, but man, this book would have taken me a decade, because I am the slowest, most meticulous editorial, and Wendy can write the most unbelievable stream of conscious brilliant first draft. And then we iterate, just boom, boom, you know, and we've gotten really good at those iterations. And I think that, to your question, are there tensions? Oh yeah. You know, you get towards deadlines or you're really grappling with the challenge. Now, I don't think we've ever, you can correct me, Wendy, but I don't think we've ever really kind of been unhappy or frustrated with each other, but we have been frustrated with the process, or we've been frustrated with something that's going on. And I think knowing, you know, if I think about the yin yang, and I think about this this day that we had, Wendy and I had years ago sitting at the academy where we were drawing the yin yang, and we realized that the circle around the outside was so important. It's what holds you together. And for us, holding together was this shared higher purpose and these common values and approach. And no matter how rough the frustrations could get, we had that. We knew we'd get through it. And sometimes we didn't sleep a lot, but that's okay. We get through it, and then we find other ways to re-energize. But, you know, I think it is about some experimenting and trying out new collaborators. And I also appreciate your point. Your supervisors, your doctoral supervisors are a very different kind of collaboration than you're going to get to have in the future. But I also think you can learn plenty from that.
Thank you so much, Marianne. I'm not sure if Wendy wants to add something or if you're fine with Marianne's answer.
No, I was listening to Marianne talk. Like I think so Marianne is the best cheerleader in the world, and so it allowed me to write what I think of as a really crappy first draft, knowing that she will not criticize it, but go back in and edit it and make it sound brilliant and beautiful. So our beautiful sounding book or writing is because of Marianne. Is because that beautiful editing allows me to write the crappy first draft. And so I do think it was about sort of being really supportive of one another at the beginning, and then really learning our different skills and being able to work together on them.
Thank you so much. And I think I'm handing over back to Margaret. And of course, we've been stalking you too. The stalking thing is kind of, that's what we've been doing too.
Exactly. Speaking of stalking, yeah, we've been looking at your social media pages, and this is one of the posts that we came across, and it's from your recent visit to your alma mater, Wendy, as part of the collaboration on this book. And it was all very inspiring, especially as you chose to stay in academia. And some of the PhD Paradox scholars have successfully graduated or are about to and are moving on to the job market. So the first question on this is, for those who will be staying in academia, it would be great to get advice from both of you. What is your advice about how to navigate this tension between teaching and researching? And secondly, how can we incorporate paradox studies in our teaching? And how can your book be leveraged as a tool guide or give those guardrails for teaching paradox?
I love that. Well, maybe I'll start and then turn it over to Marianne, and I'll just say two things. First, I had a fabulous cohort of about 5 or 6 of us that went through the PhD process together, and it's a group that I still connect with at Academy each year, and they will remember that when I was graduating, I said, shoot me if I go into academia, because I was just so struggling toward the end of the PhD process. So if anybody is feeling that and feeling like you need to get out, feel free to, and I think that part of the, what has kept me in academia is 2 things. One is finding communities of people that can be supportive at those moments of emotional tension. And I think that the PhD reading group, I hope that you are providing that for one another, not just cognitive ideas, but emotional support. And the second thing is exactly this, which is being able to have a vision. One of the reasons that I wanted to leave academia was because it felt like I was spending hours and hours and hours writing a paper that I thought only my advisor and my mother would read, and my mother would give up after the first 2 paragraphs. And at the same time, I was studying what had become a social enterprise, digital divide data, that became a paper I wrote with Mariah Besheroff. And here was, this great social entrepreneur making a huge difference in people's lives. So the other thing that kept me in academia was knowing that the long road meant that we can have impact with our ideas on some of the big challenges in the world. And it's great to be able to be in this process of writing this book that has allowed us to do that. And I totally, teaching. I'm going to turn that part over to Marianne. Oh, I'll just say one more thing, and then I'll turn it over to Marianne, which is that we are Harvard Business School, Harvard Business Review Press, which is where we're publishing, has invited us to put together a toolkit for teachers. We're in the process of doing that, and we'll and anybody that wants access to that, we will make sure you have access to that. So, Mare, teaching and research.
I don't have much more to add. I mean, I think that we're excited about the teaching tools that are coming with this book, but also even more from all the work that's being done in the community to share our practices with each other. Because I think that is just so valuable. You know, we're all teaching and trying to, I think we learn so much in the teaching mode, whether it's teaching to students or more to executives. It's such an iterative process, and Jean certainly has taught us that power. So I think those will continue to develop. I mean, we're all about open source, right? Let's keep sharing and developing. So that's the only thing I would add.
So taking over again with more social media content from you. And I'm actually referring a lot to the question that Jean was asking in the very beginning, because it's a big issue. We know, and I think that your book offers so much opportunities also for political leaders to engage more in both end thinking. And we see, referring to your post here, we have these dualities, a lot of friction in society, more and more tensions coming up. And the question is, do you think that there are sceneries, decisions, context where we first need these either-or decisions, like setting these boundaries, to then be able to engage in both ends? And I think a lot of what I'm referring to is also part of your B in the ABCD. So the setting of boundaries. The paradox of tolerance and all these decisions to make. It would be really interesting to I know that some of the thoughts are probably now repetition, but yeah, I think it's a lot.
But
I'll
take it a little different way, because I do think about, it's nice to use the B, the boundaries. So one of the ways when we talk about boundaries is we talk about separating and connecting, which goes back to kind of the yin yang, you know, how do you really pull apart the two sides, actually dive in and hold them together? And I don't think if you just were trying to hold them together, they'd blur to some kind of compromise that nobody's happy, and it's not really that, it's bland or it's not that meaningful. So I think that gets to your first point, is like, do we need to kind of make the other, right, the sides more crisp and clear? And yes, I do, because it helps us understand, okay, where are we coming from, and how do you kind of can dive into, well, what is the value, what's the possibilities, and what are the challenges of each side, both sides. I think we've kind of come in our work to realize you do need to pull apart. Now, I think then one of we talk also about different kinds of vicious cycles in the book. And I think so much in these, and I'd like to dive in more in my own research into these dynamics, but you know, the one that we've talked about for years is kind of how do you go down a rabbit hole and you get stuck in a rut. But when it comes to polarization, we basically say, look, you're talking about different groups in the same ruts, and we use the metaphor of a trench warfare. You're just digging them deeper. You're not only you know, defending your position and attacking the other. With political polarization, you see a lot of dehumanization. I mean, that the other, that, you know, the deeper, the nastier, the more challenging the insults, the deeper you're digging the trench, the more fighting comes back on the other side, just as nasty. I mean, it's just this back and forth. And then what we have is a place with a lot of casualties and no movement. So I think Wendy and I both think we've got to figure out and hope that in our small ways, we can help conversations be started, as she said, at the dinner table and other places, so that they can grow to this area. If not, we're just going to have more casualties. Or in the case of big decisions, I'd add the third vicious cycle we talk about is the wrecking ball, which is these dramatic swings that you, and I mean, sometimes in decisions like the one we're seeing here in this picture, right, is that actually the more extreme you get on one side, the more kind of the other side is ramping up, and the more likely it's going to swing to another extreme. Well, all that does is it wipes out both the good and the bad of the previous extreme, and you're starting from a new and even more challenging space. So that was a long-winded way of saying this matters. We've got to be working harder on the both and in our political spheres for all of our sakes. Wendy?
I agree.
It's like nothing to add. The words were really beautifully spoken. And I think it's a good way kind of to transferring to our last picture, which is about community, and you both as community builders.
Yeah, and you're both celebrated as, principal senior scholars who've nurtured the Paradox academic community. And this year, together with Paula, you received the inaugural Prep Community Award. So for those who didn't know about the Prep Conference, it's the Paradox Research Education Practice, and we had the inaugural conference this year. And the community is really inspired by both of you. And during the award ceremony, this is a snapshot we took from the social media page. They mentioned that it also takes academic entrepreneurs and community builders who take the time and effort to give off inclusive, generous leadership. And there must be a lot of both and thinking and doing in this regard. Therefore, what is your advice to all scholars when navigating being academics and being entrepreneurial at the same time?
Mary, should I start here? Yeah. I mean, Iris and Margaret, thank you for saying that. I do feel emotional as you say that, in part because I think that of all recognition, this acknowledgement, I think, was incredibly meaningful to me. My advice, just to answer your question, is scholarship is not a individual sport. It is a sport in which we learn more from each other and we enable better ideas by being in conversation. And this just brings me right back to those of you that created the PhD community. For me, building community is one of the things that I am proud of, and it really came out of desperation and loneliness, of feeling like I was doing a lot of this work alone, and that was hard, and it was emotionally hard, and it was also intellectually hard for me to not have people to really engage with ideas. And so I hope that if people are listening, it's to remind people to reach out to others and be in conversation about ideas. It leads to better ideas and it enables us to do better work.
I think I'd add to that as well. I mean, I completely agree. And maybe I'd add two things. And one is I'll come back to defensiveness, but the other is my gratitude very much especially toward Wendy on this. When we were, really early getting started, it was Wendy who said, we need community. We need community. And I just thinking we need to work harder. And I do think that's also a defense mechanism, right? I'm an introvert, and I think if I'm overwhelmed, the best way to do it is just to put myself in a cave. And because Wendy was saying, actually, we need community, she helped kind of pull me out of that defense mechanism, and it's been incredible. I've especially felt that with the early EGOS and continuing every single year now at the Academy as well as EGOS. I come out so energized, and whatever overwhelming sense of despair or concern, or, you know, couldn't get my head around whatever the challenge was at the time, I walk out of those opportunities thinking, oh yeah, I'm not alone. We got a lot of great movement. Look at this creativity, the brain power behind this, and what good people. I always come out of that thinking, I am so proud to be part of a community that cares so much about each other and trying to do good from the work that we are working on. And I think this book is a challenging opportunity to say, we have to share it with more people than just our community. And that feels vulnerable. Wendy and I are doing a lot of podcasts in places. We have 2 this afternoon that make me, back to Jean's question, incredibly uncomfortable. I mean, really nervous. And the adrenaline gets going and you realize that's why we're here. Why should I, you know, I used to joke I was famous to 5 people. Why? We don't have to be. And not about being famous, just about sharing our ideas, whether it's in the classroom, through, you know, podcasts, or just talking with others. So I'm just grateful for community. It means the world to me.
Great, and look at the whole community coming here today in the launch of the book, and I'm sure there's so many questions and comments from the community, and and thank you so much for responding to our reflections from the PhD community, and I'll pass on to Katrin.
Thank you all so much. And this has been, as we started out in the beginning, such an energizing and interesting discussion. And it feels like a celebration. I feel like we should have a glass of champagne or whatever everyone likes to drink to really toast to this moment. And yeah, now we're going to move into the open Q&A part. And Angela, I believe there was 1 or 2 questions already in the chat, but everyone feel free to keep them coming, and looking forward to part 3.
Yes, please. If you have questions, put them in the chat, and also just raise your hand. That's also a free format. We are an open community, so I think everybody can just open the mic and ask question. I also wonder, my personal question and gratitude to Wendy and Marianne, and also to Iris and Margaret for the great discussion. I'm very inspired. Personally, I know my PhD was saved by the work Wendy and Marianne did not know about it, have done. That's another story. But I wonder if you had the chance to really spell out the impact that you hope to achieve with the book. I know you are hoping polarization and so forth. You've mentioned some of those, but do you have a hope, if you look in 10 years, what the book would have done and what the community can do to help you achieve this impact? To start off, while the people can think about questions and put them in the chat. Wendy or Marianne, whoever.
Go ahead, Wendy.
Well, Angela, I mean, thank you for that question. I don't know that we've ever said to each other, here's where we think the book will go. And so in some ways, it feels like the book had to get written. It just had to get written. I think is a little bit of how we approach this, with the hope, you know, I think we do think there are really big issues in the world. And, you know, Katrin, your work on climate change, and I mean, there's so many people who are working on, like, those are really big issues. And we do think that both and thinking can help very pragmatically some of those issues. So the hope is maybe there's a little bit of helping people shift their mindsets, shift their approaches, really see paradoxes in the challenges we face and come to a better world. That's very lofty, you know, and but I think that, you know, our greatest hope for all of you is that we would love to hear back from you all about what is useful, valuable, important in these ideas, and what you think is important and next as well. So,
you know, the other, I guess, a different kind of tact I would take. One of the one of the rougher comments I've had, and you know, we're going to get critics, and that's good. We need critics. They make us better, stronger. But I've now heard multiple times, which is, duh, isn't that obvious? I mean, what a trite saying, both and you know, part of me, kind of my heart goes, ouch, you know, and then I think, oh, two things. I think about kind of Brene Brown's, Theodore Roosevelt quote, which I have sitting on my desk, which is be careful, the critics you listen to, because maybe they've not been in the arena. And then I kind of go, well, that might be also defensive, and say, actually, it can sound obvious and trite. If it was obvious, people would do it all the time, and they don't. So how do we start helping both and thinking, helping a paradox mindset become much more the norm? Because you can say it all day that it's obvious, but it's rare. And when it happens, it's beautiful and it makes a difference. So, I mean, maybe in my own kind of, I'll be my Pollyanna trite way, absolutely, let's keep pushing the boulder up the hill. Because at some point there's a tipping point, and we start to roll it down. And I feel like maybe that's why some of the energy happens after conversations like this or the conferences, because you realize we got a lot of people pushing the boulder up the hill, and that's needed. And I love it. And I see some great other questions on here too.
Yeah, I love the remark that Cliff is making. Yes, it's common sense, but it's not common practice. That's exactly right. Yeah,
that's a great point. Yeah.
Yeah, Cliff, I saw that too. And for those people on this call that don't know, right, Cliff has a chapter in the handbook that we wrote for the Oxford Handbook from several years ago, and has been working extensively with polarity partnerships and polarity mapping. And Cliff, it's been great to be in conversation with you all because of the brilliance of how to implement this kind of thinking with people who really need this kind of approach. So if anybody needs, Cliff, I don't know if people can reach out to you or Barry or someone to learn more about, or just look at polarity partnerships online to learn more about that.
Jan, I see your question about kind of comfort, discomfort, and the example of the pandemic. And I think the COVID pandemic, it was a beautiful example of the community, is all the writing that came out of one or more intensive global conversations like this about how do we navigate tensions in the pandemic, and what does it look like? I would add your point about the comfort and discomfort. I think one of the things that got to me in a really personal way during that was conversations as a dean. I'm a dean of a business school, for those of you who might not know that. That conversations about what do we do that were literally shut down by political comments. We needed to discuss, how do we help students, and let alone how do we help our faculty and our staff and others through some really difficult times? And rather than having a conversation, someone would throw out I could give you examples, but comments that basically politicized the discussion and shut it down. And I thought, what are we doing? We have students struggling with mental health, let alone COVID. This is an incredibly complicated, uncertain, changing space. We need to be in discussion. And I actually look back to some of those discussions and just think, I should have been bolder to have the discussions. And I found it hard. And I think that's something I will take away to say, all right, what does it look like in the future? I mean, I hope it doesn't happen again, but there will always be other challenges like that. And we have to be willing to have the difficult conversations.
Could I just insert something really quickly from the chat? That Chesla, is that how you pronounce your name? Something he observed, that conflict management plays a huge role in this.
That's so true.
And the ability to know how to handle conflict in yourself, even just what you're describing, the ability to be a mediator, not in the variable sense, but between various party sets. I think some of that is very similar
Mm-hmm.
to what you're having, Mayor. That's what it sounded like when you were
think
just.
you're right.
I think is one of the practical things is how do I handle a conflict that can derail even halfway decent conversation, let alone paradoxical conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Jean, I often think, oh, Mara, do you want to say something?
No.
I've been thinking, and I think it's a both and, but I have been thinking about the relationship between the skills for conflict management and the potential for both and thinking, and have been thinking about the directionality of this. Does both and thinking and a both and approach enable you to engage better with conflict management, or do conflict management tools, are they necessary for adopting and engaging paradox? And I think that's a both and. I have certainly talked about it both ways, that we if anybody, again, I don't know if Camille's still on here, but if anybody's ever worked as academics with the National Center for Diversity and Development, it's a brilliant group run by Carrie Ann Rockamore. And one of the things we talk about in the book is that she trained her entire team to learn better conflict management skills in order to handle both and. And at the same time, we've seen where people have trained people in both and skills in order to be better at conflict. And so I think they go hand in hand. And I don't know how to talk about that in a succinct way, but I think those are both really important skills.
I see there is a comment from Jennifer. It's not exactly a question, but I think it's hinting to some kind of questions on like whether leadership has paradoxical approaches. Is that correct, Jennifer? But if you want to say something, please take the mic and add to that.
No, it's not exactly a question. I was just following the conversation and what Marianne said, and I feel, yes, so I think when people tell you, well, isn't it obvious or something? And so this is the question I was asked about paradoxical leadership. Isn't that what good leaders already do? And yes, it is. So, but not all of them do. And so it's so valuable what Marianne and Wendy did to really explain paradox and how to thrive with paradox to a broader audience, because not everyone knows how to do it and they need to know. And then I think it's not about inventing paradox, it's already there, but it's about describing it and inventing ways or showing ways on how to deal with it. And I think that's incredible. So I just wanted to put this thought out there.
Thank you.
You know, Jennifer, I agree so much. And I think one of the things that it's been, I've loved the conversations that I've had with leaders, and sometimes Wendy and I have had together with leaders who really think paradoxically. And while I agree that great leaders tend to do these things, there is a step change in when I meet a leader who really thinks of them as paradoxes, really thinks about these are interwoven opposites, and I got to think about how they work together and how I make the most of the opposites. And to me, that's a little different than, yeah, I need to be humble and confident. I need to be, right? I need to be tough and compassionate. And because there are absolutely people who get that. And then I think there's this other level where they think in terms of paradoxes, even if they don't necessarily use that language. And that to me, I find it really exciting when you get to talk to someone who that's part of their DNA. And I don't mean like they were born with it, but they've really figured out some wisdom to that interplay. Wen, do you agree?
Yeah.
No, that was
100%. Yeah.
Maybe a nice bridge to this comment is also the question from Ivo. I know you're there too if you want to ask yourself, but really asking about the sectors. Do you see that there is some sector that is more paradoxical than other, or less paradoxical, is more either or, whether it's like healthcare, central governments, small companies?
That's a really tricky question, because I think we've seen good and bad. At least I have in everywhere. Because sometimes I will think, I'm thinking of this conversation that Wendy and I had last week with a really entrepreneurial group, that it was so fun and energizing. And they, you know, we were talking about hybrid work, and you could feel their kind of paradoxical thinking as they played through the home and remote. And so is it entrepreneurs that are really good at this? But I mean, I've met plenty of entrepreneur that is a really, I mean, big ego kind of driver, that it's not, I don't know that they are necessarily all that paradoxical in their thinking. So I think it can vary quite a bit. Wendy, have you seen patterns, do you think?
Well, yeah, I you know, Ivo, I love this question. It's not something that we have spent a lot of time parsing out. Here's what it makes me think of. And so I'm curious what this community thinks about that. Here's what it makes me think of. It makes me think of, you know, going back to this idea of experiencing tensions, and whether we experience more tensions as a function of the context that we're in, or as a function of the way that we think about that context. And I think it's both, because I think most things are both, or we think it's both, you know. And so when I think about sectors, I remember as a student of Mike Tushman's, one of his previous PhD students did a whole PhD on the cement sector and building materials, and talked about how slow moving that industry is compared with the high tech sector, you know, and one of the things that Marianne and I put out in the 2011 paper is that the pace of change is one thing that helps surface paradox. So the high tech sector surfaces paradoxes at a rate different from the cement sector. And yet you could look into the cement sector and see people who see paradox in the cement or, you know, building material sector different from, you know, others, one another. So I think there's more work and research to do about that. And I'm curious what people think about it. And I don't know that it's something that we've spent perhaps a lot of time thinking about at this stage.
Well, Cliff added a great comment, yeah, about that maybe the higher the analytical orientation, the higher the either or orientation. And I think in general, that is likely to be true. I don't know that I've seen maybe that explicitly tested. And at the same time, I think Capra's The Tao of Physics is one of my all-time favorite books about the quantum physicists of Niels Bohr, Einstein, and others who, I mean, talk about analytical, and they were deep into Eastern mysticism and Buddhism and Taoism, and saw all these brilliant philosophical connections between what they were seeing in the physical world and what others were seeing in the mystical world. And I, you know, are they totally unique? Well, maybe they are. They were kind of geniuses, to say the least. But I think this would be an interesting empirical question.
From my experience in Belgium and the Netherlands, there is a huge demand of well, local government and central government, because they're struggling with a lot of stakeholders to please, in fact, more than private businesses. And if you look at private businesses, it's more, let's say, family business, because there are also the struggle between the family and the business, etc., than large corporations. But I was just interested if you see the same patterns in the US.
Eva, what I love is that, you know, in some ways, and I don't know if our Paradox Mindset team is here. I think I saw Josh here earlier. That what I love is that indeed in this Paradox Mindset, we've disentangled both the experience of tensions and then the way that we think about those tensions. You know, and so again, you know, it may be that in these settings there is a higher experience of tensions, and you know, than others, and then there's the component of, well, do we bring both and approaches, both and thinking to those tensions, and that differs in settings.
You know, it's interesting. There's something that I think, I can't remember who said it earlier. I was thinking about the two dimensions of paradox mindset, right? That you kind of see and are sensitized to tensions, and you think paradoxically. And while we've set them at those two dimensions, it reminds me of the work Jean wrote in '88 that really started us thinking so much about framing, that as you see what you expect to see, those two become really interwoven, right? Yeah. I mean, Wendy and I see them in our sleep. I bet there are a lot of you that see paradoxes everywhere. and it's connected to our paradoxical thinking. So I think that might be back to, you know, what do you hope the book is going to do, or what do we hope all of our research is going to do, is are we sensitizing more people to look, to see and experience these, and help them, instead of moving to the defensive paralyzed side, moving towards a paradox mindset. I mean, Jean, what do you think? Putting you on the spot.
No, I had just stuck a comment in the comments that I think is not entirely irrelevant to what you just asked. Several in the 1980s, I think Jane Levenger wrote a book on stages of ego development, but others have also written on to develop the capability to think complexly. Some of Struford, I think, is one of the people, and there are others. This has gotten sort of out of fashion the last few decades. But I think maybe, like you're talking about, how do we help people develop the idea to do this? I think I remember that ways were being developed based on Piaget to help people learn to think more complexly.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think some of that exists, but it's just out of fashion. And I think maybe something that helps people to think more complexly can help. But I think what you're also saying is, how do you help people develop the capacity not to be overrun by their emotions, which I think is not at all handled by how do we help people think more complexly.
No, that's understood.
So that, I mean, that's one way of imagining it. I think there's probably more to it than that. But there also, you know, some of the very early conflict literature was talking about, do you have, you know, assume does one side win? Does neither side win? Do both sides win in a way that isn't compromised, but they develop new, develop something new that's based on it? So I think there was a time when some of the ideas were coming out that are relevant, but that just aren't around anymore. That maybe.
Yeah, that we could pull
Maybe
from.
it's worth playing with some of the things that were really fashionable in the 1980s. I mean, just for the hell of it. Because, you know, I'm actually old enough that I can remember what was fashionable in the 1980s.
Well, I think as we see the micro foundations of paradox kind of work really developing, these are places that we can kind of return to. The thing that's in my head, the more through this conversation, is I think I'm increasingly fascinated by the interpersonal. And I think that is such a difficult challenge. I mean, I think about Lotta, our work with Lego, and Lotta did all the hard work about these sparring sessions and helping people work through their tensions. I think it adds a other layer of challenge when you have political or ideological differences in the room, and those sparring feel like they're against each other, not against a tension per se. And maybe it's part of how do we focus it on the greater tensions and not on our differences in that. So the conflict management is very much in my head too. And how would we do sparring in a different way? I don't know, Lotta, if you've done any work like that, but that's a different challenge to me in some ways.
Well, she did just post in a comment that Keegan was writing about this in the 1980s too.
Oh, thank you, Lotta.
And so, I mean, I think you should say more about it rather than me talking.
Yeah, well, we had a conference once. You were actually there, Marianne, when Klaus Meiggaard, a Danish researcher, also talked about Keegan's. He'd been studying organizations and the levels of complexity in leaders' mindsets, and he actually had 5 different levels, Keegan, that he referred to among leaders. And so the more mature the leader was, the greater capability to take various positions in a conversation. And the better the discussions went on, and the more conflict management they were able to go into.
Ah, very nice.
I think that's very interesting work.
So while the conversation, sorry,
Oh.
go ahead.
Oh, I just want to add, I love this conversation, and I also love all the references in the chat. So thank you.
I know, me too. Look at them. They're
Connecting this
great.
into a deeper conversation. And there's a piece of me that feels, I remember conversations long ago, or not so, whatever, over the years, in which the question was, okay, who in an organization has to have a paradox mindset, and who do we just not care about having a paradox mindset and thinking paradoxically? And so there's a bit of me that feels a little uncomfortable that we are ascribing paradox mindset as a bit of intellectual elitism, and the invitation to being able to, and I don't think this is easy, and it's a bit idealized, but I also want to invite us to think about how we engage with people and paradox at different levels and different experiences. How do we engage our kids? People used to tell me kids have to be very black and white until they're age 10. Well, that's not how I've raised my kids. And, and do we think, or people would say, look, it's fine for people to have a paradox mindset at the top of the organization, but the person who is giving you your burgers at McDonald's, they just have to have everything black and white. And I don't know, invites me into thinking about how do we think about that more broadly.
Yeah. Thanks, Wendy. I think this is a great provocative question also for us. If everybody wants to put some reflection of today in the chat, as we are 3 minutes before closing, and we want to tell you how to get the book soon. So just like share in the chat, what did you learn today? Do you have a last burning question that we can take with us in the future? And I guess I'll let Marianne and Wendy tell us how to get the book, and then we'll close soon.
Wendy, please do.
Well, I don't know how many of you were joining us at the Academy. First of all, again, thank you for this session. This is a bit of our coming out party. The book officially, the official publication date, its official birth date is August 9th, although there are, plenty of copies available and accessible. So first of all, if anybody wants the first chapter and intro, we can send those along. Second of all, if any of you will be at the Academy, please come join us. We're gonna host the traditional drinking away tensions that this community has become known for. Marianne and I are going to host it, and we just found out from the publishers that they're going to send 50 copies over. So anybody that is there, the first 50 of people, if there are going to be 50 of us together, we have copies available that we will give out. We'll be at the Anchorhead Coffee Company. Please join us there. And I'll just say as a closing thought, just if there are ways that these ideas can be useful to you and your work, and we can help with that,
Sure.
Please let us know. And we are grateful for any of you that will share this idea out more broadly with others. So please feel free to share this, share the book, send it along to others. So Mayor, I'll turn it to you.
No, just our deepest thanks, and we look forward to the continuing conversations. And I think if there are always silver linings in challenging situations like the pandemic, but one of the big ones is that we've all learned how to do things like this morning, globally, virtually, and staying connected in so many different ways. So thank you all the organizers. Thank you, Jean. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you, Marianne, and thank you, Wendy, and thanks everybody. Thank you, Jean, and all the reading community. And just to jump on what you said, Marianne, to stay in touch and to keep the conversation. So there are different ways we can do so. There is a website, Leverage Intention, where you can also find some of the recordings of the past PDW that we had. So we had Barry Johnson. We also had conversation with other scholars on a variety of teams. So check the website to know what we have done. There is Camille. I don't know if you're still there, but if you want to receive the newsletter where events such as this one or what's happening in AOM are shared, also send an email and she'll make sure that you receive the newsletter. Also, we have a LinkedIn page, Facebook group, page group, but you have to ask access because it's not public. and as well as a Twitter account. So you can also check some tweets of today and know more about what's happening in the community. And yeah, if you want to help us co-organize future sessions, we do this, I think, twice a year. We try to have a discussion. So of course we don't present books every so that was just a different format, but we try to have conversations around Paradox with scholars, and we try to give opportunities to young scholars to present their papers, their work. So get in touch, co-organize it with us. We're really excited to work with you, and I really want to thank everybody. We had at some point 47 people showing up, so thank you so much for being here and engaging in the conversation and leaving some reflection in the chat. We'll get in touch, and thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Close.